At Eton Bridge Partners, we're a leading executive search and interim management business. My own specialism is in HR hiring. So what that means is I work on behalf of clients everywhere from a kind of 50-person business right the way through to a big FTSE 10, placing candidates into senior and executive level roles within the HR function. That's my specialism, although my business covers all of the corporate functions. Anywhere from a chief people officer down to, downwards. And what that means practically is salaries between about 100 and 300,000 pounds in general annually. By background, as you said, I'm an HR director. And although I've been at Eton Bridge for 5 years, my HR knowledge comes from a very different world, not professional services. So I come from the utilities sector, which isn't particularly glamorous. And most recently, I was HR director of a subsidiary business, of a big FTSE business of approximately 1,500 people. And I was leading that organisation from an HR perspective through financial turnaround post-acquisition. So I'm used to what my colleagues would call really gritty businesses, and now I work in professional services. In my spare time at work, I lead much of our external client-facing inclusion and diversity agenda, not actually from a position of expertise. I'm definitely not an inclusion and diversity professional, but out of passion. So specifically, I focus on mental health and the relationship between organisational and individual wellbeing and organisational performance, although I do get involved, as you guys know, in the broader conversations as well. I'm also mum to 3 children under 5, including 3-year-old twins, one of which is currently losing her mind upstairs. So I'll ask for your forgiveness if you can hear her in the background. Daily, people ask why and how actually I moved out of HR and transitioned into search. And I think it's quite relevant to say that, honestly, it was a move I never, ever thought I would make. But I was made redundant during my maternity leave. And that was a real kind of pivotal point for me to think about my longer term career. And I found myself just a bit more open to different opportunities. And I'd previously been a client of Eton Bridge Partners, so I had a relationship with them. Now I say I get to do all the best bits of my old world, but I don't have to do all the worst bits. So I don't argue with trade unions or run big redundancy exercises anymore. And I'm really fortunate to do that. And I remember that every day. Eton Bridge also holds their values really front and centre. So our purpose is to build teams that drive business performance, and we believe in kind of core threads of relationships, of trust, spirit, hopefully you'll see that in how I talk about things today, and excellence. So we know we can't place everybody that we meet, and we can't help everyone in a direct way, but we kind of live by the mantra that everyone we come into contact with, we can probably add some value to their job search or their career in general. So, and help them along the way. And I hire people and network with people day in, day out. That is my job. And I hope that means I can offer a little bit of insight into the world of recruitment, executive search, which was a world that I just hadn't really come across before, and also salary negotiation. So I'm excited, and thank you for having me.
Oh, no, we're so pleased to have you. And I feel like there's so much to unpick from everything you shared, certainly about your career journey. And if this were a career session, I feel like I have a million questions. So maybe we'll have to get you back for a session on that specifically. But I think what your breadth of experience will bring is hopefully some diversity of thought to some of the responses you'll give. And I'm really excited to delve a little bit more into your expertise. And you talked about working in HR and then going into executive search. So that means you've probably had tons of experience looking at CVs, LinkedIn profiles, really working out what the ideal candidate is. And, it wouldn't be a salary negotiation session without us starting to talk about what really makes that ideal candidate. Before we get to the point of give me the money, what does that actually look like for helping ourselves as candidates to stand out on our CVs and our LinkedIn profiles, and what attracts recruiters to a great candidate?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about the process as exactly that. So it might end with a job, and right before the end, you might have the salary negotiation, but there's all of those foundation blocks that you need to put in place right from the beginning. I mean, firstly, there's no right answer. You'll find a way that works for you. And in fact, my colleagues and I argue about this all the time because we see, you know, different CVs and tens of CVs a day. But I thought I would share some tips and my personal opinion, but it's far from gospel. So don't feel like every one of these is absolutely the, you know, the law. I think there's some important things to flag. The first is get the basics right. You know, make sure you can be found. You'd be surprised how many, or maybe you wouldn't, be surprised how many really senior professionals I meet on a monthly basis for whom they don't have their telephone number or their email address on their CV. And while I probably can find them on LinkedIn, and I may well have them on the system that I use at work, it makes my life harder. So, you know, I'd really encourage you to think about what is included on your CV, your name, your phone number, your email. You don't need any more than that. If you've got a really common name, adding the LinkedIn link to your CV is helpful because then someone can find you easily, but it's definitely not necessary. And I think I'd always say avoid adding those potential flags for bias. So marital status, age, location, they're funny things that hiring managers in the huge pile of what used to be paper on their desk, but now is digital applications. How do I sift these people out? And when I first joined Eton Bridge, I had a client for whom they were situated at the end of the Northern Line, and they knew it was quite a long way for candidates from central London to travel. And I presented the best candidate to them. And we spent about 25 minutes debating whether they would or wouldn't commute from where they lived, based on what's said at the top of their CV, to their location at the far end of the Northern Line. And of course, the candidate didn't enter into that conversation with me not knowing where the offices were, but the client could not get their head past the fact that it was a longer commute than he was willing to do. So these biases come in all the time. And so it's just funny what hiring managers use to screen out the volume that comes through. So anything that could add potential flags for bias that so many of us think are just normal things to include. Use the space really well. I talk all the time to candidates about thinking about white space on your CV. So if you imagine you're reading a sales leaflet for a local shop and it's just full of information, or something that's quite simple and tells you where the shop is and what it's selling and what time it's open, then you know which one you'll prefer. And the temptation, because weirdly we've all been brought up on this assumption that your CV has to be as close to 2 pages as possible, means that we use teeny tiny font and we make the margins smaller and smaller, and we try to just pack all this information into 2 pages, which means that there's so much you just can't take it in. So create space for people to think. If you think about in the old world, we print off a CV and write in the margins as we were interviewing somebody. I don't do that anymore, we're all digital, but still having some space to enable the person who's reading it to think is really important. Consistent formatting. If you're going to use bold on your job titles, do it all the way through. If you're going to use bullet points, do them all the way through. Make sure your text is all the same size. And highlight the important things, particularly job titles, company name and location. Again, you'd be surprised how many people only read that in a CV, and you've put your blood, sweat and tears into the content and all the bullet points and your key achievements and your responsibilities, but someone isn't going to read it. Most people don't read the full detail of the CV. I'd give a tiny bit of overview of the organisation if you think that it's not a well-known business, and that overview should be size, scale, how many people, turnover, just to demonstrate a bit of commerciality. But also consider the priority that you use in your LinkedIn profile or your CVs. If most people only read the first half page, because that's what you can see on a screen, or they're only going to look at your profile paragraph on LinkedIn because you have to scroll for the rest, amazing how lazy people are, make the most of that first bit of information. Pack that with the information that you want them to know about you. What's your USP? What sets you apart? At least 50% of the CVs I read start with, I am a committed and extensively experienced HR professional with 20 plus years of experience. And I think, oh, that's the same as the last 5 CVs I read. And actually in this age where we have a bias towards younger candidates generally, if you are a bit older, that's not necessarily helping you by talking about your years of experience. So thinking about what's the first thing you say about people, what are people going to remember about your CV in those first couple of lines? Also, I'd avoid things like being passionate and committed. So is everybody else. So what makes you different? I also avoid lists of skills, whether that's on your LinkedIn profile or on your CV. Back to the bias point, if a hiring manager is reading it, or some poor person in talent acquisition who doesn't know anything about the function in which you operate, but they've got a list of key things they're looking for in your application, and you don't list one of them, it just might be that, you know, there's 40 different skills in your particular job area, and you've only talked about 10. So they'll screen you out based on that before they've got to the meat of your job description. I'd also think about how long these things are. Largely, your LinkedIn profile should reflect your CV. You might be a bit more commercially sensitive about what you share on there, but your LinkedIn profile will be seen by so many more people than your CV will be. So you should make sure there's as much information on there as possible without it being overwhelming, back to this point of how long is it going to be. Chronological is generally well established. Most people feel comfortable about that. But you can use a skills-based approach if you're more interested in interim management. That works quite well, but on the permanent market, it tends not to land brilliantly. And the one that I love about CVs and LinkedIn is that people feel compelled to be honest. And I'm absolutely not saying lie. But it's funny how many people feel like they have to write, you know, that they were on a career break and what they were doing with that time to justify the time away, or if they had a period of maternity leave, that you've got to spell it out on your CV. And it's back to this bias point of, I'm reminding people that there's a reason they might want to hire me, might not want to hire me. And we feel compelled to be as transparent as possible on CVs. And this is information that's just not relevant. It doesn't matter that you've had 3 sessions of maternity leave. You know, why does it matter to the hiring manager? And I guarantee you no one's going to come back later and say, well, you lied on your CV because you didn't tell us you had mat leave. So thinking about what's included and how you're using that space. How much do you include on your LinkedIn? How far back do you go? I had a lovely chat with my dad a few years ago because he asked me to review his CV and his LinkedIn profile. And I really had to find the right words, but I also had to gently suggest that as he worked in IT, maybe the experience he'd gained before I was born wasn't going to be that relevant. And yet he really was like, I just want to demonstrate how broad my experience is, and people will know these programming languages and it's really important. And it took him a bit of time to realise that actually this stuff wasn't that relevant. Most people aren't going to have, at the time I was 25, most people aren't going to have experiences that are 25 years old on their CVs, but lots of us will go into loads of detail of stuff that we did over 10 years ago. And actually, how relevant is that to the job you're going for now? So I'd start stripping out the stuff that talks about who you used to be and the skills you used to have, or the things you've got in your back pocket that you could play if you needed to, but they're not talking about the growth that you have, what you could do in the future. So really thinking about what you include in those profiles, I think is really interesting. And I think the final point is thinking about what you say and the order in which you say it. So it's really easy to just fling stuff into your CV, make sure you cover everything. But there's loads of stuff that's just not that relevant to give you some space and make sure your message is really relevant to the reader. Does it really matter that someone knows that in job A you managed 3 people and in job B you managed 10 and in this one you're an individual contributor? No, you could probably very quickly at the beginning of your LinkedIn profile say you're an experienced people manager, and then you save a bit more space later on and they learn that about you earlier. I have run a research team and I'm talking to them a lot at the moment about looking at CVs critically and thinking about, what is this person telling me that I don't expect them to have done? So if it's obvious I'm looking at an HR business partner role profile, I expect them to be business partnering somebody, building a strategy, working directly with an executive leader. So I don't need them to tell me that in their CV. And if they do, it makes me think, do they think that's special in a business partner role? Because actually that is how it should work. So really thinking about the content and what the reader is seeing first about you. I think I talked a lot there, but hopefully that's helpful.
Those are all amazing tips. I could actually see a couple of people nodding there on webcam as we were going through those. And I just think it reflects so much around many things that I didn't even think about myself. And I've worked in HR, and I think the things that I've taken away the most are making sure that you're using that space effectively. And I think I love that you mentioned the future landscape. What role are you applying for, and how does your CV reflect that you're capable and able to do that role versus putting in lots of information that you think sounds great, but actually what does the hiring manager need to know? But I love that you also alluded to LinkedIn and that consistency with your CV, bearing in mind the sensitivities. And I guess that brings me to the next question, because most of us know that lots of jobs end up potentially having some candidates in the prospective kind of list before it even goes out to be advertised. And LinkedIn is very fast becoming a really big tool for accelerating visibility. And we had a session in March around visibility on LinkedIn. So for anybody who's joining us for the first time, please do check out that session on YouTube if you haven't already. But I'd love to hear from you around how we can use our existing or new networks to help us to drive careers more proactively as candidates.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing to say is that everybody has a network that can work for them and can probably work harder for them. We generally find it really hard, and I think in this country we feel really uncomfortable flexing that muscle and that tool. But it's so important. I mean, our primary tool of finding new talent with our clients is LinkedIn, as well as our networks. So being able to flex your network and your social presence is really important. Even when a role comes to us and we're out to search, we don't advertise our roles. We flex our network and our relationships to ask for recommendations of people we know have probably operated in an adjacent sector, might know somebody that knows someone else that could do the job we're looking for. We don't advertise for a few reasons, and that's probably a different session, but largely because it's actually very inaccurate. We get lots and lots of applications from people who do not have the skills that we're advertising for. And that gives us loads of work to do. And that's hard in terms of managing people's expectations, assessing the candidates that come to us. So that's why, there's almost, I think it's a bit of a dark art of executive search, to be honest. And it feels a bit uncomfortable, but you can use your network really well to get into those circles and to find those roles. So there are three routes that you can use. The first is your existing network. So my advice would be to go and have a look critically at your LinkedIn connections. It's unusual to have fewer than, say, 350 connections, because if you think about, even if you only have a couple of years worth of experience in corporate life, you come across and you work with so many people, even if only fleetingly. So really go back and look at each of the roles that you've done, and are those contacts and colleagues and teams and managers reflected in your LinkedIn profile? And if they're not, spend a couple of hours and connect with them all. People are delighted to be connected on LinkedIn. It's an easy thing to do. And by creating those connections, it's just expanding your reach into a different network. If you're actively seeking a new role, talk to the people in your LinkedIn network or your off-social network about that you trust, even if you haven't seen them in a long time. Reach out, especially to those people who've moved on elsewhere from the place that you work together. Ask for their help. Tell them that you're thinking about a move. Ask them how they made that move. Who would they recommend that you speak to help you make that move? The worst thing that can happen is someone doesn't reply. Like, that's the worst thing. The best thing is someone says, well, it's funny that you should contact me because I know a person who knows a guy who's recruiting X. And you'd be incredibly surprised how often that's the case. In almost every search I run, there will be someone who's come from, somebody's wife's best friend's dog groomer, knows someone who works in that area. And so they don't know whether that person's any good at the job, but they've heard they're looking. And so they land up in our process and we assess them. So it's really important to flex your existing network. The second is creating a new network. So attending, and I think COVID has helped this, right? This kind of environment. Attend real life or virtual events and think, instead of thinking about where would people like me hang out to network, flip it and think, where will people who hire people like me hang out and network, and go there. So don't hang out with a load of other people who do jobs just like yours, because they probably can't help you in terms of moving your career on. It could be, free CIPD events, even drinks after work. Your best friend's company might be having a do. It doesn't have to be a formal let's all stand around awkwardly and drink wine and eat cheese in a sort of horrible old dingy place in the city. It can be completely different. And wherever you meet people, virtually or otherwise, follow up on LinkedIn afterwards, suggest that you meet for a coffee. And again, people will rarely say no. Being able to lift your head up and look outside of your own organisation is hard to find the time. So someone proactively doing that's important. And then the third route is to ask your network for recommendations and introductions to firms like mine. We get approached by a lot of people and we work really hard to give everybody good service, but it's undeniable that if there's someone we know really well recommends a candidate to us and says, this person's amazing, I've worked with them before, we will think, brilliant, thank you, you've helped us. And we will look after that person and make sure that we try and find them a role. It's a great way to stand out from the volume of people that apply directly for roles. You know, you can also do the same thing by approaching firms directly. So if there's a business you really want to work for, find from LinkedIn or from their website who heads up their talent acquisition team, who's their chief people officer, and write to them and say, or the CIO, I'd really like to work in your organisation. Who's the best person for me to speak to find out more? And worst thing that will happen is nobody replies. The best thing that could happen is you get an amazing new job. So I'd really think about the individual connections from all of the networking that you do, and don't assume it has to be awkward networking. Generally, it's one-on-one, building relationships and stuff that you have in common. So I said at the beginning, I've got 3 kids and I have twins. So since I had my twins 3 years ago, I now have this incredibly strong network of other twin parents. They just seem to float into my life. I don't know how it happens, but it comes up into conversation. And genuinely, I've lost count of the number of twin parents I've placed into roles in the last 18 months. Not because they're actually, I mean, we are better than other people, but generally not because we're better than other people, but actually because we found a personal connection, they're memorable to me. So when I'm hiring for a role, I'll remember them. There's a USP, there's something different about them. We've made a personal connection, and I have a different network that another headhunter in another firm might not mind. So finding those, special connections. I am not advocating twins for this, by the way, because for the rest of your life, it's dreadful, especially your social life. But it can, finding that connection, that mutual interest. It's a bit like, the golf club used to be, finding a reason to connect with people.
Amazing. I think I should join this exclusive twin club. I'm going to get to work on that and do some research. But I love what you shared, because I think a lot of people do think that networking is this massive mythical area that can be really daunting. And I love what you talked about, starting from how you identify yourself, but equally looking at where will people be who are hiring people like me. Actually, those are very simple questions to start with. And I can certainly attest, in my own career, most of the opportunities I've had are from networks that I've built. So you're absolutely right. Utilizing those networks is so important. So I'm mindful a lot of people are on here because they want to understand more about salary negotiation. And we've got about 10 minutes before we open up the Q&A. So just to remind everybody, please do keep asking your questions and we'll allocate some time to go through them. But going to the bit around establishing your value on the market, a lot of individuals find it very hard to actually understand what price tag, if we call it, should I be putting on myself? And when I'm going out and asking for the amount I'm looking for, how do I actually decide what that number should be? So what advice would you give on starting to establish value as a candidate before having that conversation?
I think it's really important first to understand how you benchmark against the market. Speak to recruiters, ask us the question, be honest about your current salary, as they'll have the widest knowledge without any concerns that they're opening themselves up to a challenge, as a direct organisation might do. They have the widest knowledge of how you compare. I meet hundreds of people every year, so I can give you a good idea of where you benchmark from a salary. You can ask peers outside of your own business too, so people that you know that do similar roles to you, but that can be awkward. People don't really like talking about money, so it is uncomfortable. So it's easiest to do it through a recruiter. Once you know, though, how you benchmark, make sure that you communicate with people how you know. and how you compare to others at your level, whether that's on a par, underpaid, overpaid, and take that into account when you're entering salary negotiations and talking about salary expectations. And if you're underpaid against the market, and I think most people generally have a perception that they are underpaid against the market, but naturally only 50% of people are, but the law of averages. And why is this? Is it because you've stayed in one place a long time, and so you've got that, what we call the loyalty discount? Have you made a career change, which means that set you back against your peers? Have you been out of the market for a while? Are there other factors? It could be that you're in a really female or male-oriented industry and you're of the opposite gender. And that the reality is it can mean that you drop out of step with your peers, and you may know that and understand that. You may not know why you've fallen out of step. There could be no one big reason, but over time you've fallen out of step. And being able to set the context and tell the story with a recruiter or a client that demonstrates how you've got to where you are, why you have the expectations that you have, will really bring to life where you want to be and why, I think. So have a really clear idea, but I would also I wouldn't beat around the bush when it comes to talking about salary. So if someone asks you the question, and recruiters will do this without hesitation, how much do you get paid? Answer the question. Lots of people will start with the context and then build to the number. But if we think there's too much explanation, you start to think, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? So if you get paid £100,000 a year, tell them that straight away, then give the context about why you sit at that number and why your expectations are different. I'd also think about, also don't be embarrassed about talking about money, right? We go to work, we get paid, it's fine. But we do like transparency. Clients and recruiters like transparency. And in our hiring process, we'll ask candidates at least 3 times at different points to make sure that people are giving us consistent figures. So answer the question the same way each time. And also explain how your package is made up. So I'd always start with your base salary plus your bonus opportunity, talk about any car allowance or any quirky, weird sort of London waiting or, travel allowances or anything like that, rather than talking about total package. Total package always feels a bit nebulous and vague, and it becomes hard to negotiate on total package. And then also talk, after all of that, about your aspirations for your next move, and ask whether it's a hiring manager, whether it's a recruiter, whether or not that's their view on whether they think that's achievable. And, it just takes the awkwardness out of all of it, I think.
No, I'm really glad you've mentioned that, because I think, especially when you're looking on social media, there's so much advice out there around the best way to approach these conversations. And honestly, until you said those things, I personally always thought it was best to hide it. So I think that's actually quite liberating to know that you can have open and honest conversations and give us a straight talking starting point that your recruiter can help you if you've got that trust. So that's really good to know. And I love that you've almost alluded to what you say.
Oh, sorry, my line cut out and I've talked over you. It's very rude. But I've got a real life example from today. I met a great candidate for a role. I asked him what his salary was. And his response was, well, I know the benchmark for this role is about 140K, and I earn a 6-figure salary. So I'm in the right ballpark. And I thought, well, a 6-figure salary is a big old bracket, right? And it's good that you think you're in the right ballpark, and that's helpful, but I will need to be specific to my client. So actually, by not giving me that information, it's the thing that could mean you never get in front of my client. Because if I can't give them the information they need, then I'm going to have to leave you off my shortlist. So we are the people that you can trust with that information, even if you don't feel comfortable talking about it with an end hiring manager.
Yeah, and I actually see a golden thread actually in everything you shared, because when you talked about the CVs as well, you mentioned not putting certain things on your CV, but actually talking to your recruiter about those things, so the maternity gap, etc. And I think there's definitely something about building a great trusting relationship with a recruiter, being as open as possible, and then enabling them to support you in that empowerment around the discussion. So that's really, really useful. I'll probably ask the next question around what to do when it becomes a sticking point. So for many people, you might say, this is what I think I should be earning. And then a company says, well, actually, this is our budget. My favorite is when they say the salary is competitive. I think, what's really a competitive salary? So how do you negotiate in a way that's a meaningful negotiation without coming across negatively?
So I think there's two conversations. One is when you're in a business and you feel like you might not be being paid equitably to your peers or according to your worth. And then there's the external, you're in an external process and you are negotiating an offer. So there's definitely two ways to approach it. If you're in an external process, it's so much easier through a third party, whether that's an in-house recruiter or someone like me. So it depersonalizes it. It's much easier for me to say to the client, they want to really join you, but they're going to need 10K more, than it is for a candidate to say, I really want to join you, but I need you to pay me more, £10,000 more a year. And I feel really bad about that. And I'm sorry I'm asking. And now I'm flushing and I'm embarrassed. So it's much easier to use a third party, but you can't always do that. But generally, for me, it's quite a straightforward conversation with a client. They go, oh, okay, I can't do 10, but I could do 5. Or I can't do anything, but I could do a joining bonus. Or, I don't think they're worth that, so you're going to need to tell them. So it's not always a positive outcome, but it's clinical and it's easier. Also, if you know how you benchmark, how the role benchmarks, it's much easier to talk about the value of that role compared with what's on offer. And this is back to, and if you've ever done any kind of negotiation training more broadly, not just about salary, you have to start with what's your worth, what's the worth of the thing we're negotiating over, depersonalizing it again. So what skills, experience do I have that I can sell ultimately on the open market? But also, what are they getting for that money? And what am I trading for that money? So it may be, if we take £100,000, might be your bottom level for a next move. That might be a lateral move on salary, or it might be a small increase. But that could be your bottom level. But you think about what's my trade-offs? Well, my trade-off might be I can walk to work. I can do my school run. I know they're going to offer me continuous personal development because they have an internal university. I know that I'm being hired as the successor to my line manager. What's the trade that I'm getting for taking a lower salary? But actually, I definitely wouldn't, even if they were the most amazing business and the most amazing company and it was next door, I still wouldn't drop below 100. So what are your parameters? And what's your ideal number that actually, if they paid you, you'd work for anybody? Because I think they're two extremes, but it helps you understand how much is money important here and how much is it actually about worth. And talking, this takes me to my internal conversations. So much of what we talk about on salary is not about the number. Of course, the number is important and it makes a difference to our lives. But often the conversations internally are about, do you value me in monetary terms in the same way as you value someone else who does my job? And do I feel like I've been treated equitably? And if not, I can challenge from a place of fact and feeling around worth rather than about pound notes. If I still don't feel like I'm valued here at an organisation, will I feel any better actually if you pay me more money? Probably not. If I don't feel the attitude towards me has changed. So you have to really think about what's the purpose behind negotiating the additional salary, whether that's an external or an internal move. I think you can also think about the overall makeup of your package. If the salary on offer or that you're already on now is much lower than you feel is your worth, I think you have to question whether it's the right role and the right organisation for you. And you have to work out, am I willing, by pushing, by negotiating, am I willing to walk away? Am I willing to push so hard in an internal negotiation that actually from here on in it all feels a bit uncomfortable and I may need to go eventually to the external market and find a new role if I can't get what I want? And if you're looking to join a new organisation, if they turn around and say, no, I can't give you the additional 5, 10, 20K you're asking for, will I turn the job down? And you might not, you might say, okay, I desperately want it anyway, so I'll take it, but at least I've asked. And now I feel better about joining because there's not that niggle to know I didn't ask. And actually, I do think there's quite a big difference in gender here. So if I place a guy, generalising, but if I place a man, they will generally push me to challenge on salary offered. If I place a woman, they may challenge me to challenge the salary, but they do it from a really apologetic and uncomfortable place, largely speaking. So I think you do have to think about, and I think about this as a woman, how comfortable do I feel and am I absolutely certain in my worth, and will I put pardon the expression, well, I put my money where my mouth is when it comes to negotiating. And, you know, I've had to learn that myself too. And I've done my own salary negotiations. So it's not always for other people. And returning from maternity for me was a great opportunity to do that both times. I wanted to work more flexibly, but I did not want my pay to be reduced. And so I was very clear about my worth to the organisation and why I felt that actually in real terms that was a salary increase. And once you're clear and you can demonstrate that, it's a much easier conversation, even if they can't actually pay you that money, but you know that they understand the value that you place on your skills. Does that make sense?
I love that. Yes, I love that the conversation is all about value, and I love that you kind of almost are able to separate the emotion from the conversation and have a very factual, clear, and I guess also mutually beneficial conversation, right? Because it's about what the company is getting from the role and kind of flipping it into their interest versus it just being just about you. So those are all great nuggets. I can see that there's been tons of questions since we've been speaking. So I will stop talking now because I know if I went on, I would ask 10 million more things and we've got to let the people have a voice. So I will hand over to Bacola, who will go through our Q&A questions. Over to you, B.
Brilliant. Thanks, Minnie, and thanks, Olivia. I've been scribbling and mentally absorbing all of the information. I think one of the questions, which is a thread through most of the questions that have been put on, there's two opportunities to negotiate salary. So when you've got a new role, but there are a few questions around how you negotiate salary in role with a current employer. So have you got any hints and tips to do that in a positive way so you don't kind of come away from the conversation with a bit of bad blood between both parties? Yeah,
I mean, my mantra for life, whether it's about salary or otherwise, is be honest, be likable, and be reasonable. Just because you want something, God, anyone who's got children knows, just because you want something doesn't mean you get it. But you can explain the reasons why to your kids, why you might not be able to deliver on something. They might not be the true reasons, but we do give reasons. And so I think if you can be honest and pleasant and reasonable about these things, then generally speaking, that is the best approach. Internally, though, I would say because people feel so uncomfortable talking about pay, and often other people's pay doesn't really enter people's minds. Like if you ask me how much my team all got paid, I could give you a ballpark, but I wouldn't know specifically, whereas they could probably tell me to the nearest £100 how much they get paid, you know, gross or net. So it's much more personal sometimes than we give it credit for. So I think if you're going to talk to your current organisation about salary, give them the heads up and don't be embarrassed about it. In your one-to-one in October, say to them, look, as a closing comment, you know, when we meet next time, I'd really like to talk about pay. I think I might be falling out of step with the external market. I'd like to talk about that, but I thought I'd give you a bit of a heads up so that I don't spring it on you next time. It's totally reasonable, very likable. You've given them a sense of the conversation and you're giving them time to prepare. So but you're signaling the intent. And I think that's really helpful. As a line manager, if any of you do have line management responsibilities, being doorstepped about anything where you don't have the answer is really hard. So I'd be thinking about that. And I also think you can look at the external benchmarking reports that are out there. You know, we're talking now about gender pay gap reporting, ethnicity pay gap reporting, all of this stuff for many businesses is in the public eye. And even if your organisation doesn't have to report on these things, that doesn't mean that you can't ask the questions. You know, you have as loud a voice as everyone else in an organisation. So if you'd like to know, you should ask. You won't always get it answered, but you should ask. And it holds the door up to your organisation. But back to my point about being reasonable. I think the other part is that it took me a long time to realise in my career that there's no one else advocating for me. I might have sponsors and mentors and a strong network and great clients, but ultimately the person who's going to fight my corner is me. So therefore, I shouldn't be embarrassed that I'm trying to advance my own career, because so is everybody else. So if I'm okay with owning that and advocating for myself, then so will everybody else be.
Amazing, thank you for that. And I think that's a great takeaway, certainly for me, that it's a conversation, although uncomfortable, it needs to be had. I think a lot of people shy away from it and then think it's easier to just leave than actually have the tough conversation. So yeah, so that's a great response. Thanks, Olivia.
I think that, sorry, B, just to add to that, it is undoubtedly easier to get a bigger pay rise if you make an external move, like
Absolutely.
undoubtedly.
Yeah.
So if you really, that's another question to weigh up. How much am I willing to risk my network, my worth in this organisation in order to move externally to get the pay that I want? Yeah. And sometimes you have to make a hard choice, but it is definitely much easier to do it if you move externally.
Yeah, no, great point. So we got a few questions through. You were talking earlier about using the space in your CV and making sure there's room to breathe and, putting the relevant information on there. One of the questions is around advice on if you've got periods of unemployment, because they're hearing that employers don't like blank periods. So what do they do about that? So it might not be mat leave, which is easily kind of explained. Maybe there was a period someone was made redundant or lost a job. How do they reflect that in their CVs?
So I think it's back to this be honest point. I mean, it's highly unlikely most people, even if they were made redundant or unemployed for however length of time, that you sort of sat on your butt watching TV, not doing anything. You will have been advancing your career through learning, networking, or just working in a job that maybe was much more lower paid than you were used to, but you would have been earning a living in some way. So think about the skills that you've developed in that gap and add them in, or give some context at the beginning of a CV. But I'd always be honest. And we're hearing about this more and more with the last 18 months that we've had. What will people say if I'm out of work for longer than 12 or 18 months? And I think especially in this most recent period, a bit like you only have to see a gap in employment in 2008 on a CV. And whether it's related or not to Lehman's and everything else that went on, your brain naturally assumes that that's what happened. So nobody even asks the question. And the same with COVID, I think, people won't really ask. They'll just go, oh yeah, well, obviously they lost their job because of COVID, they had a break, they were homeschooling or whatever. So I think you might need to give some context to what you were doing, but so few people would be doing nothing that I just don't think it's much of an issue. And I'd be upfront with it. And even if on your CV all you write is career break, so there's no explanation, and then when you get into an interview, you're able to talk about it, but be ready, be prepared with the explanation, and don't ask for forgiveness or be embarrassed. People lose jobs or they can't find a job. So just, front it up. And you could even say it's a really difficult time, but that shows you as a human, again, making you different to other people.
Amazing. Got a question here around how advanced in your career do you have to be to start thinking about entering into salary negotiations?
So that is a really good question. And my husband's daughter is currently in her first role. And so she and I have been talking about this quite a bit. I don't think you have to be advanced. I mean, it's a funny term, really. I think you can do this from the beginning, back to advocating for yourself. But the risk is, if you're earlier on in your career, that there's this kind of perception you've got to be grateful to have a job, and it's incredibly competitive, especially coming out of university. So you may want to trade off the having a job over not having a job and holding out for a salary. And it's harder to do, to negotiate, if you don't have any work experience. So you have to work out what you're willing to negotiate. If you're going to negotiate, you always need to have tradables. And so if you're going to, on anything, so if you're going to negotiate on salary, your tradable might be you have fewer opportunities that you can go for. Undoubtedly, you will find a job that will pay you the money that you want, but it might not be the job that you want. So you're going to have to trade that off too. But I think advocating for your own salary and talking about salary expectations and aspirations, longer term, where you'd like to be from a salary perspective in a new employer or as you're talking to employers, you shouldn't feel embarrassed to do it. But they just may have a lot less money to play with for early careers.
It's interesting that you say that, because I think the word worth and confidence has kind of come out quite a lot during the session. And I know, with our work with Excellerate Black Futures, we talk about that a lot. Certainly in the Black community, there's lots of different things at play here. And I think it's a huge barrier. So there's so many things, that we kind of have to contend with. And then we have to kind of be boldly going into conversations and saying, this is my worth and I want to be paid X. And it's a really awkward, uncomfortable conversation to have. And I almost think you need a real dose. I talk to Winnie, I call it your full chest. Like you need to go into that conversation with your full chest to say, this is what I want. But it's tough, right? And no one, there's no kind of rule book that, you know, is gospel that people can kind of read and go, right, tick, tick, this conversation I need to have. So it's great to kind of hear that. But I also think it's kind of, I'm kind of thinking, great, I have some tools now, but it's a really still tough conversation to have.
Yeah, it is. It's incredibly difficult to have. No one likes talking about money, whether that's because we have it or we don't have it. We ran an event at Eton Bridge last week talking about mental health and kind of purpose and reconnection after the pandemic. And we had a long conversation about mental health and how important it was for organizations to really focus on that. But the reality is it's so interconnected with financial health. And it's very easy to sit in your kind of middle management role, thinking about, you know, your well-being of your team, et cetera, if you get paid, you know, above minimum wage and, you know, it's a fairly secure situation to be in. So I think that financial piece broadly is just really hard for people to talk about. And the more we do, it's like any other taboo subject, the easier it becomes. But it's, I think, one of the more challenging ones to do. I would advocate for practicing, though. Finding someone that you trust to talk to you about it and say, right, I'm going to have this conversation with my line manager, with the HR director. Help me. You be them. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, and practice it and practice it and practice it. Because in the moment, it's so easy to just slightly just cringe inside and you lose your nerve. So yeah, the more you can hold your nerve, better.
Absolutely. I think the only thing I would add, and this is me with my hat on, having spent quite a lot of time in financial services, it makes sense to know what the process is. So sometimes people think, well, this is what I want, but maybe there's a static process that says only halfway through the year can we do X, or it's at a certain point, or if you're investment banking, you go for analyst or associate to this, to that. So sometimes knowing the process means you're not hitting your head against the wall trying to have a conversation in January when nothing can happen all the way to June. So it just helps you strike that bit better, I think. But yeah, that would be my only 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion.
Great. So we have another question around, I guess, a type of organization. So if they're claiming that the base pay is static, so perhaps they have if you're at this level, this is the pay and nothing can be done about that. How do you manage that kind of conversation with your employer?
Well, that is the case in many organizations. So if that is the situation you're presented with, it comes back to you making the choice, right? If you love working there and you're okay, but would like to be paid more, then, you know, you should carry on. But if you know this is the process of getting more money here, and you know those opportunities aren't there for you, then you probably need to think about an external move. There are plenty of industries, plenty of roles where that's the case. It's stepped salary increases that come with, you know, length of service as opposed to increases in skills. I don't think that's a particularly positive approach to reward, but I'm not a reward director. But, you know, there's plenty of organizations that take that approach.
Okay, thank you. And a really great question from Jill. And I'm really surprised that this hadn't come in earlier. So how do you approach your company if someone is being paid more than you for the same job?
Yeah. So back to my point about being honest, being reasonable, but challenging. Work out who's the best person to challenge, because that isn't always your direct line manager. Give advance warning, tell them by email or in passing that, look, I want to talk about pay because I've become aware. Depersonalize it from the person that you know and make it about you and your worth, not about the comparison with that person. But the comparison is important, but the reason you're asking for the increase isn't because they're getting paid more than you. It's because you are getting paid less than them. And it's a subtle difference. So you're asking for equity. And I would flag to people that that's the conversation you want to have. I would be prepared, however, that in most organizations, the response may be, but they have more experience than you, or they bring a different set of skills to the table. So you just need to think through what the response may be and then have some counters. If it's an exact same job, you know, year one primary teacher and a year one primary teacher, that's a terrible example because public sector pay is a whole other world. But if you do exactly the same job, you sit next to each other, do exactly the same job, then there is not really an argument for it. But most organisations will probably come back with, they've been here longer, we hired them in at a higher level, there'll be a reason. So you need to be able to reasonably and rationally argue that not only is that reason not good enough for you, but also this is about equity and feeling like your worth is seen in the same way as that person. But I wouldn't name the person, talk about how you found out the information. Organisations can be a bit touchy about that. And in some organisations, mainly US led, it's a dismissible offence to talk about salary.
Yeah, agreed. Awesome. Thank you very much for your response on that. The final question, and this is one personally from me, and I don't know if it's a question or maybe it's just a gripe, so forgive me the way it comes. But when you're talking to organizations, I find it really interesting. And this is, you know, how you said, sometimes you have to go external to get that bump. And why is it that organizations seem happy to pay that bump to someone who's brand new rather than take a chance on someone internal, either doing that role or kind of giving them a stretch assignment? Do you see what I mean? It boggles my, and I'm a HR business partner, but it boggles my mind every single time.
I know, that's insane, right? It doesn't make any sense. And I call it the shiny and new phenomenon. So, you know, we might have 1,000 pairs of perfectly comfortable, very, very good shoes. And yet you see a new pair and you think they're the ones I'm missing. And they do exactly the same job as everybody else. They might be exactly the same make, they could be the same color, they could do the same, you know, be the same, whatever. But we all have this attraction generally as humans to something that's shiny and new and additive to what we already have, even if it's going to cost us more. And organizations are no different. Sometimes I think they struggle to see the difference between the person in front of them at doing the job that they do now and their potential. And because I've seen you in job A, I'm struggling organizationally looking through a talent lens at how you could do job B. It feels like a big stretch. So therefore, to do job B, I'm going to have to go and find someone who's already done job B. The reality is people who've already done job B don't want to come and do job B again. They want to go and do job C. So they naturally have to pay more to bring someone in from the external market, and it is a much higher risk. So, I mean, you know, I'd be out of a job if people didn't have the shiny and new complex. Let's be honest. And we'd also see less increasing in salaries if people didn't move externally. But I do think the HR professional in me thinks it's a real shame that some organisations would much prefer to hire externally and take that enormous risk on someone you don't know, whether they're a great cultural risk or a great cultural fit, will they get on with the rest of my team, etc., etc., and would prefer to take that risk than build up the skills of the person that sits in their organisation already. So I think what you can do as an individual, again, is advocate for yourself, talk with and network internally through your organisation. We haven't talked about this very much. You know, find your big sponsors in there. That could be the chief people officer, it could be, you know, the chief financial officer, it could be lower down than that in your organisation. Network hard and find people that will advocate for you and your onward development internally, because then you'll naturally find yourself in the talent conversations and you're pushing forward and talking about your aspirations, because sadly no one is probably going to do that for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Olivia. It's bang on 8:30. We've probably run out of time for any more questions, but Olivia has kindly said that you can all connect with her on LinkedIn so you can continue the conversation on there. Thank you so much, Olivia. I have taken lots of notes. I will probably ping you with further questions actually, so I'll be top of the list there. But thank you everyone for joining. It's been a great session. It's all recorded, so you can go back and listen in again. But again, thanks, Olivia. This was really great. Thanks so much.
You're really welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone.